The sensation of revulsion or unease that we experience when we look at something highly resembling a human, such as a realistic mannequin, a wax sculpture, or a highly detailed humanoid robot is known as the uncanny valley. It's essentially an instinct deeply rooted within us, and theories as to why humans evolved to fear, or at the very least feel disturbed, by near-human figures vary widely. One idea suggests that our ancestors in primitive times started making use of their emerging pattern recognition in order to avoid approaching, or simply to distrust other humanoid species at the time which, despite resembling us, were not quite the same and could pose a threat. While other theories suggest that the uncanny valley evolved with the purpose of serving as a trigger of disgust for people to instinctually avoid approaching diseased or even dead individuals, in order to avoid contracting various pathogens or infections. Regardless of the reason why we have evolved with such an instinct, it's apparently there to stay. And horror media? It loves making use of phobias or common fears in order to scare or disturb its audience. Because of that, one of the most common horror tropes in any sort of media is that of the creature that looks human but isn't. Today I want to discuss exactly that. Media centered around the idea of false humans. Whether in video games, movies, or books, I'll explore several types of false human archetypes, show how they differ from each other, and give examples of works that use them. Let's begin with the first archetype, the Replacer. The Replacer, as the name implies, is essentially an archetype of false human that focuses on a target specifically, abducting or straight up killing it, only to afterwards replace it with. They take on their physical aspect, their mannerism, their speech patterns, at times even their memories. Their goals usually tend to vary, with the Replacer either making use of its new identity in order to find new victims to replace, or to live out the rest of their lives under this newfound identity or disguise, like a sort of a parasite in the society they infiltrated in. We can think about Doppelgangers or changelings. The Mandela Catalog is probably one of the most known horror series on YouTube at this point. The author of the series is Alex Kister, and the series first began in 2021 with the episode Overthrown. The series is centered around the idea of alternates, creatures that take the guise of humans, although in an imperfect manner, in order to attempt to trick other humans and eventually replace them. The Mandela Catalog has a deeply religious theme to it. In fact, it is a canonic event within the series, which takes place in an alternate history setting where the very first alternate, the Archangel Gabriel, prevents Christ from being born, taking its place as the one true savior, leading people to unknowingly worship what is essentially a devil in disguise. The alternates in the Mandela Catalog are unique in the way they operate, as opposed to other similar creatures tropes in media. They function essentially as a hive mind, and they don't rely on physical strength to overpower the people around them most of the time. Rather, they make use of psychological warfare in an attempt to drive their victims to death by their own hands. It's important to note that the alternates are not perfect copies of other humans. While they could fool just about anyone from a distance, most of them appear to be imperfect, distorted. They bear impossible physical traits that can make them easily distinguishable upon closer inspection. While alternates have presumably existed for millennia now, they appear to have been dormant, so to speak, and are now resurfacing and making their presence known. The general public appears to be aware of their existence. Various PSAs were made in order to detail how civilians should, or rather shouldn't, approach someone if they suspect them to be an alternate. Meanwhile, members of the police force are instructed to simply ignore and not respond to emergency calls regarding alternates. There are two possible reasons for that, the first being that the police in itself as a force is aware of just the threat that alternates pose and realize they are not just outnumbered, but also not properly prepared to deal with one, and attempting to do so would only serve to lose precious manpower and bolster the ranks of the alternates. The second theory is that the police was never instructed to do so, and those instructions were in fact the result of alternates corrupting instructional tapes, as they have demonstrated the ability to manipulate and use analog technology to their advantage. I do really like the idea of alternates being capable of manipulating analog technology, twisting tapes and programs in order to further their agenda, as it is essentially creates a second layer of dread to this whole ordeal, where it isn't just the people that we can trust anymore, but technology in itself. Another creature that operates under the same idea of the replacer is the changeling. In European folklore, the changeling was believed to be most of the time a human-like creature, more often than not a baby, that will take the place of a kidnapped child. People believe that different beings or creatures, such as fairies, demons, or trolls, will kidnap a human child and replace it with one of their own, often making use of magic to alter the child's appearance to resemble that of the one it had taken its spot. This was actually somewhat of a common belief across many different cultures. In medieval Scandinavia, for example, it was believed that trolls considered that to be raised by humans was a far more respectable upbringing, rather than to be raised by their own kind, and they would often attempt to kidnap children and replace them with one of their own. Another example of a replacer in modern media is perhaps Ennard from the series Five Nights at Freddy's. In the fifth game of the series, Sister Location, Ennard is this amalgamation of different funtime animatronics, with Ennard's main goal being that of escaping from the facility he is currently being held. In one of the endings of the game, the one considered to be the canonic one as far as I'm aware, Ennard ends up scooping the insides of Michael, the human main character of the game, in order to essentially wear his skin, or the outer part of his body, as a sort of a disguise. Something that works initially, as Ennard is shown being able to fool most people around, only for the entire ruse to stop working as soon as Michael's body begins decaying, forcing Ennard to abandon it. The Imitator. The Imitator is a particularly interesting archetype. Imitators are a type of false human that are generally portrayed as not being fully capable to pass as a human. Rather, they are capable to imitate or mimic something that might initially help them appear as one, usually from a distance, making the difference between them and an actual human painfully obvious upon closer inspection. This trope is generally used for creatures that do not wish to fully pass as a human at all times. Rather, they imitate human speech or physical appearance simply to lure their prey. Even in the animal kingdom, this is not a behavior unheard of, with predators such as the anglerfish or the snapping turtle baiting their prey by initially appearing as something completely different than what they truly are. Vita Carnis is a YouTube body horror series by Darian Killoy. In this series, we are presented with a premise of a new species of creatures being discovered. Creatures whose primary trait is that of being made out of living flesh tissue essentially, with some of these creatures being either domesticated or used by society for a variety of purposes, from cleaning rotting bodies in battlefields to decrease the risk of infections and diseases spreading to simply becoming beloved household pets. But some creatures from this new species will end up in fact competing with humans, challenging their position on the food chain. One of such creatures is the Drusidatum carnis, more colloquially referred to as the Mimic. Mimics are the quintessential example of a false human imitator. They have 4 limbs and are bipedal, but a simple look at their appearance makes the difference between them and a human unmistakable. Their arms appear much longer than that of a human, their noses are flat, and they bear very large eyes, although most noticeably their skin is bright red in color, resembling a large monstrous person with no skin at all. This is the stage of adulthood in a mimic's life. They are yet unable to consistently fool anyone, and they rely on stalking their prey and ambushing it while alone as a hunting technique. But if a mimic manages to somehow acquire a consistent supply of a human prey, they will eventually evolve into a humanoid mimic. Their skin and physical aspect changes into resembling that of an actual human, although still heavily deformed and easily recognizable upon closer inspection, forcing them to still avoid direct contact with most people and camouflage themselves by wearing large baggy clothes, mostly to cover their faces, which bear unnaturally bulging eyes and uncanny smiles, while their tendency to walk in a digitigrade posture by essentially using only their toes to stand on, keeping the rest of their feet lifted up, can also be a dead giveaway into their true nature. Now, another imitator that comes to my mind is perhaps the elephant in the room. But is it an elephant? Well, no, but it could be. Obviously, I'm referring to the Skinwalkers. The subject of Skinwalkers, I think it's not easy to approach for the purpose of this video. You see, when you say Skinwalker, most people are going to think about a nondescript creature whose power revolves around shapeshifting into either a human or an animal in order to either lure or approach its victims without giving its true nature away until it's too late, while their real aspect is somewhat resembling of that of the Rake. The thing is, that is pretty much the definition of a Skinwalker within internet, or rather within general pop culture, while in truth, Skinwalkers originally used to represent evil witches from Navajo folklore, capable of cursing others and morphing into different animals by wearing their skins or possessing them while using their powers for exclusively malicious purposes. The Skinwalker is practically another folkloric creature, much like the zombies, the vampires and the werewolves that have over time lost their original story, as a new one was slowly molded around them by the general public. On to another imitator though. In Gemini Home Entertainment, an analog horror series made by Remy Abode, various themes are explored, but the one element that is relevant to the purpose, or rather to the theme of this video, is that of the fake people. Present from the first episode actually, and recurring in other episodes afterwards, these creatures are basically simulacrums of human beings, created by woodcrawlers, aliens from the Iris. They look identical to actual humans, but they're only capable of repeating certain words or phrases on a loop. Even their actions seem limited. One that stood out as particularly creepy and off-putting to me personally was the silhouette of this woman, which wouldn't even bob while moving, giving the impression that she was simply levitating or floating or moving in an extremely unnatural way. It kind of reminded me of the cardboard cutouts that will move around in the Home Alone movie, although in this context it was more terrifying than comedic. These human simulacrums will become, as I mentioned previously, a recurring creature, meant to act as bait, as in other episodes they could be seen simply walking or standing in place, screaming for help, possibly in order to attract prey. And if the idea of imitators sounds pretty terrifying to you, I can name one game that actually features one, but that you probably wouldn't have thought about it right off. And the game in question is Terraria. Can you guess what I'm talking about? Well, if you said the nymph, then you are correct. When mining the cavern layer in Terraria, you might rarely come across this odd creature at first, and hovering your mouse over it will reveal it as the Lost Girl, a seemingly innocent NPC in need of help. Much like the Bound Wizard or the Stylist, unlike those two though, approaching the Lost Girl will cause her to transform into a nymph, turning hostile. Of course, this is an enemy that most probably will fool you once, and only once. But I guarantee you that the very first time meeting a nymph in Terraria is always a shocking moment, given how unexpected it is, as this is, as far as I'm aware, the only enemy in the game that pretends to be a person in need of rescue. And while we are on the subject of something being clearly not human but still attempting to imitate one, I'd say that an honorable mention should go to the Skin Bandits from Kenshi, a faction of robots or skeletons being the name for robots in Kenshi, that generally act as antagonists in the game. The name of Skin Bandit derives from the fact that they will attack people they find around their territory, kidnap them, and force them into what the game refers to a pillar machine, in order to subsequently wear their victim's skin in an attempt to imitate people. The Corrupted. When I came up with the name for this archetype, the Corrupted, I was thinking essentially of something that was perhaps on a certain level, or at least partially, still a human, and at times it does its best to pass as one. If you don't get what I mean exactly, think about vampires, for example, or werewolves, creatures that were once humans but ended up transformed into something different. They still maintain a semblance of their former selves, but have now become something different, sort of an in-between state. They look still human on the outside, and they might still act like one, but their true nature is something else. For a false human to belong into this archetype, I believe first and foremost is required that they maintain something of the human they once were, and are now attempting to still pass as one in the eyes of society for a variety of reasons. One such example that comes to my mind is perhaps Kaneki from Tokyo Ghoul. While the ghouls in Tokyo Ghoul do fit the general definition of false humans, as they are creatures that pretend to be humans during the day only to become fierce flesh-eating predators at night, they are a different species entirely and do not fit under the archetype of the corrupted. They belong in an entirely different one that I will talk about after. Kaneki, on the other hand, he is the exception. His entire story revolves around the idea that he was once a human and was turned into a ghoul, leaving him into this state of limbo between being a human and now something else entirely. The infiltrator. This is a very interesting archetype of false humans. Infiltrators distinguish themselves from the previous categories in the following ways. They are an entirely different species altogether, unlike the corrupted, that does not seek to replace any particular person, unlike the replacer, but have become extremely adept actors, or at the very least bear a good resemblance to humans enough to pass as one most of the time, unlike the imitator. All of these differences were enough in my eyes to earn them their own archetype. Infiltrators are generally represented in the media by creatures who attempt to blend into human society either in order to remain hidden, while not always being directly antagonistic to humans, or to pursue specific goals or objectives without arousing suspicion or drawing on too much attention. They're not interested in becoming a human, they are not interested in acting like one, and most of the time is something that they do out of necessity and would much rather prefer having not to do it if possible. As I said previously, we can fit the ghouls from Tokyo Ghoul into this archetype. Another notable example of this could very well be the Terminator robots from the Terminator franchise, or the aliens from the movie They Live, where the protagonist, upon wearing some special eyeglasses, realizes that most of society is inhabited by alien creatures that pretend to be humans while wearing a fake skin and occupying positions of power in society in order to brainwash the general population into, unknowingly, doing their bidding and follow a highly consumeristic lifestyle of servitude. We can also put into this archetype The Witches by Roald Dahl. The Witches is an old novel for kids from 1983. It was actually one of my favorite books as a kid, and the entire premise of the book revolves around the idea of witches living within human society, wearing wigs, long gloves, and uncomfortable shoes to disguise themselves as women in order to kidnap and dispose of as many children as possible, as they will find them to be utterly repugnant. And on the subject of witches, I think that another notable example are perhaps the hags from Dungeons and Dragons. Green hags, night hags, anise hags, there is definitely plenty of them within D&D, depicted as powerful spellcasters and hoarders of ancient and arcane knowledge. Hags are some of the most vile and evilest creatures, and one of their favorite things to do is usually make use of glamorous spells in order to disguise themselves either as frail old women in order to induce a false sense of security, or as young attractive ladies. They tend to live isolated from the rest of the world, or occasionally in groups of 3 in order to form hag covens and bolster their powers, but they do also enjoy visiting towns and villages under their human disguise in order to, more often than not, acquire children, which they are so very fond of eating. The puppet. This is another interesting archetype. So far, excepting the corrupted, every false human essentially belonged to a different species, a creature that was not a human but pretended to be one. The puppet, similarly to the corrupted, was originally human, but unlike the corrupted, they have lost every mental semblance of their former selves. When I say the puppet, I want you to think about some exterior force, perhaps a hive mind, a spore, a virus controlling what is now possibly the husk or the body that used to belong to a human, but now it doesn't anymore. Whether that is a permanent or temporary effect generally depends from the media they are depicted in, but when I try to think of examples that will belong in this archetype, I will say is definitely The Thing from 1982's John Carpenter's movie, where the major antagonist is this organism capable of infesting and assimilating both animals and people, pretending to be one of them, both as a mean of self-defense in order to remain concealed and to gain the upper hand in order to further corner and assimilate others, with its end goal being that of simply assimilating as many people as possible. I actually think that The Thing is a perfect movie that manages to portray really well the sense of paranoia, mistrust and deception in the themes of a false human. Something that is very similarly also reflected in Server Blight, a horror series by two idiot Germans on YouTube, really similar both in concept and execution to the 1982's The Thing, and before any Germans decide to be angry in the comment section, that is the name of their actual channel. Lastly, I wanted to mention what is obviously one of the prime examples of this theme, and that are the Visitors from No, I Am Not a Human, a game that was released this year whose premise revolves around this apocalyptic scenario where the sun has begun pretty much scorching and burning everything, making it impossible for people to leave their homes during the day, while at the same time being threatened by the presence of visitor creatures pretending to be humans in order to infiltrate the dwellings of other people and murder them at night. The issue with the Visitors is that I wasn't quite sure in which category to place them. The game doesn't make an effort to go into too much detail regarding their true nature. What we learn about them is mostly rumors from other survivors or visitors themselves, and their true nature is mostly left up to interpretation. We know that apparently visitors come from underground, and that people that are buried can themselves come back to life as visitors, with some visitors not even being fully aware of the fact that they are visitors, so you can see how these nuances actually make them a bit hard to be placed under any specific category. But No, I'm Not a Human is the quintessential example of a piece of media that makes a really good use out of the false human theme. Now, if you have any opinions or ideas in regard to this video, if you would like to talk about some false humans from games, movies or books that you've enjoyed, let me know about them in the comment section down below. As always, I'd like to thank you for staying until the end of the video, and I'd like to thank this channel's members for their support. If you'd like to join them, you can do so by clicking the join button down below. Otherwise, you can still support me by leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. And now, it's time for me to go. I will see you in my next video. Bye bye.